Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Farm to School Grant Reviewer Training. As I mentioned before, I'm Maika Sanderson, and we are going to get started on our jam-packed agenda. I hope everybody has their coffee or other caffeinated drink. I will be throwing a ton of information at you today, but all good info that will be helpful for you as you dive into the grant applications that we will be assigning to you all next week. So a few housekeeping things. Audio is through your computer. If you are having trouble hearing, you should turn up your computer speakers. If you still cannot hear us, even though your computer speakers are all the way up, I recommend you turn your computer speakers down, and then you use the dial-in number that we have here on the screen. So that's how you kind of resolve your audio issues there. Another housekeeping tidbit, if you would like to make a comment or ask a question, you have to use the chat function since the line is muted for participants. So go ahead and use the chat box that's found in your left-hand corner to communicate with us and ask us any questions that may arise as you listen to the webinar. The webinar, as you know, is being recorded. I will make sure to send out a link to everyone shortly thereafter, probably sometime tomorrow or the day after. I'll also make available to everyone a PDF of the slides, as well as attachments and resources. So we're still making a few updates to a couple of the reviewer resources, so you will be getting a hold of those probably a little bit later this week, either late Thursday or early Friday. And then after the webinar, we would hope that you would take our survey so that we can know how we can better improve this training for next year. We're always looking for ways to improve. So quickly is the agenda here. So we're going to do a little bit of background. I'm really going to zoom through this because everyone on this call should have already attended the Farm to School 101 training, which kind of gives you that high-level view of what is Farm to School, the background on the grant program, and the broader work that's done by my team, my office, the Office of Community Food Systems. Then we're going to get into the grant cycle overview. So what does the review process look like kind of from like the 1,000 level feet? And then we'll also talk a little bit about selection, which is after you all have submitted all your scores, what happens with all that information? Then we will kind of deep dive into the review process. Then we'll transition into getting you all some tips for success on how to submit the best feedback possible. And we'll also talk through some kind of tips around how to use the various systems in order to submit that feedback and access your applications. Then we'll do a recap because I would have thrown so much information at you. So we want to make sure that you are left with your key next steps after the webinar. And then hopefully there will be time left at the end so you all can have a space to ask some questions. All right, so let's go ahead and dive into the background on the Farm to School Grant Program. So the mission of the Farm to School Grant Program is to increase access to local foods in the school meals program. So that includes school breakfast, school lunch, the summer food program, and the child and adult care food program. So we really want to make sure that through these grant funds that these projects are really making it easier for students to have access to local foods during these various times of the day in eligible schools across the country. In addition, it's really also important that through these grant funds that students are able to have opportunities to be exposed to nutrition education, agricultural education, as well as experiential activities that allow them to really have a better understanding of where their food comes from and how their food impacts their health and their success for the rest of their life. So really quickly, the Farm to School Grant Program was created through Section 243 in the Richard B. Russell National School Lunch Act. So each year we are charged to give $5 million annually to train and do supporting operations, plan, help eligible entities purchase equipment, and equip them with the tools and resources to develop school gardens and partnerships, and effectively plan and or implement or scale farm to school programs in their school districts that also span into their communities. So our grant program is a bit unique. eligible entities really span across a number of stakeholders just due to the nature of farm-to-school work. So we give funding to schools, school districts, state and local agencies, Indian tribal organizations, small and medium-sized agricultural producers and groups of small and medium-sized agricultural producers, as well as nonprofit entities. So really quickly, again, all of this information was covered on the Farm to School 101, which is why I'm kind of like dashing through the fire on this. But I just wanted to refresh everyone's memory so we're all on the same page. So for fiscal year 2018, there are 3 grant types. So if you are an applicant, you could have applied to one of these 3 tracks. So the planning track, which is really a space to submit projects that are all about structuring a farm-to-school initiative that really leverages best practices and embeds them into the foundation of a farm-to-school plan. So the award amount for that, you could apply for $20,000 to $50,000 award. For implementation, it's typically for folks who are a bit more advanced or who have a bit more experience in the farm-to-school arena. And so they're looking to expand an existing farm-to-school effort, or they may be starting something new but already have a fully conceptualized project and kind of have all of the resources and information on hand to execute on that project right away. So the award for that particular track can range from $50,000 to $100,000. And again, the applicant is really determining how much that project is going to cost and what they're applying for. Last but not least, we have training grants, which are really to encourage the hosting of state and regional and national level conferences or trainings, which can cover various topics such as culinary skills, local procurement, school garden development. For these particular grants, the award amount ranges between $20,000 and $50,000. All right, we are now into the grant cycle overview, and I'll try to not be as fast-paced because I know that this will actually be newer information for many. So for the fiscal year 2018 grant cycle, I wanted to give you all a bit of a general timeline. So we released the opportunity in October. We accepted applications through December 8th. And then in January is where we kind of start to do that prep work where we, we have our reviewers, you all, and then we assign applications to you all, get them distributed, and then through the end of January to February, you guys are kind of conducting those reviews. And then March through April, we actually collect all that data, clean it up, make sure that it's tight, and then we use that information to actually go about ranking and selecting those awards. We send that information to the selection official here at National Office, who then reviews that list and determines whether or not to move forward with the recommendations. And then hopefully by May, we are in a space to be able to actually announce who those lucky farm-to-school awardees are. So in terms of just providing you all kind of the overview of the review process just a little bit deeper, so we're diving in a little bit deeper here. Each reviewer will be assigned to a 3-person team. And so your 3-person team will be led by your fearless team leader, your team lead. And each of those teams will be assigned a grant type. So for example, you may be on team 1. You will have 2 other folks, one of which is going to be your team lead. And you will be assigned applications that are all from one grant type. So you don't have to worry about kind of having to know all the different ins and outs of every single grant track type. You will be assigned to just one. All your applications will come to just one. To give you all a quick heads up, and we'll dive a little bit deeper later on in the webinar, there are several systems that you use as a reviewer in order to access your applications and then actually evaluate them. So to access your applications, you'll be using a software called Watchdocs, and then to actually submit your scores for those applications, you'll be using what's called partnerweb. More to come on that. So in terms of if you're wondering like, oh man, what team am I on? What grant track have I been assigned to? That information hasn't been sent out just yet. We will be making sure to provide that information to you all either by end of this week or very early next week, so definitely by January 22nd. So to get a little bit more granular about what to expect in terms of the calendar of events for the review process, I think that phrase sounds more exciting than due dates, is that the week of January 16th, which is this week, you all will probably towards the end of this week start to get your application assignments. Again, you should have them no later than January 22nd or 23rd, but you would have received an email that we would have shared these applications with you. You'll access them, and then you'll be able to kind of see those particular projects that you've been assigned to evaluate. The week of January 22nd is where you start to do some work. So we expect reviewers the week of January 22nd to actually start opening up your applications, accessing them, and making sure that you don't have any conflicts of interest. So you're going to want to take a quick look at the proposal narrative, and you're probably going to want to take a look at the support letter just to make sure you didn't work at any of these organizations, that you don't have any direct ties to any of these organizations that could bias you in terms of the review process. The other thing we're going to be asking you all to do is to actually log into partnerweb. So right now that week is a lot of the logistics. So we want to uncover any issues during the week of January 22nd so that by the time January 29th hits, you are ready to actually start conducting your review and thoroughly reviewing each of the grant applications that you've been assigned. So the review period is from January 29th through February 23rd, and we actually split up the review period into two separate terms, if you will. So the first term being January 29th through February 9th. That's a 2-week period. And during the 2-week period, we expect you to actually thoroughly review each of your grant applications and submit your feedback through an online form in partnerweb, where you will assign a score and you will also assign comments, both in the form of strengths as well as weaknesses. More to come later on. So once you do that by February 9th, the second term begins on February 12th, and this is your second 2-week period. And during that time, you're going to be expected to talk with your team and discuss the scores that you have assigned to your applications, and talk about the strengths and weaknesses. More to come about those two different terms and what you'll exactly be doing during them. So in terms of the selection process, the decision criteria really includes, and to be clear at this point, you as reviewers, your role has ended. So now we in National Office have received all of your average scores. We have all your written feedback, and just to kind of give you a sense of what we do with that information. So we take that information and we rank the applications by score, and then we kind of add some more magic sauce into the formula, if you will. Which includes, we take a look at geographic diversity. So if all of the top performing applications are in California, we can't actually award all of our Farm to School funds in the state of California. So we want to make sure that we are touching as many different types of states across the U.S. And that it's well represented among urban and rural communities, as well as underrepresented communities. We also want to make sure that we are touching our FY 2018 priorities and making sure that funding is in line with that. So if you're wondering what are FY 2018 priorities, that information is available in the Farm to School 101 training. So go ahead and refresh. You can refresh your memory about that. But we in National Office actually apply those priorities. You don't as the reviewer. Okay. So after we have ranked and applied all the priorities, we then send that list to the selection official, who will take a look and kind of determine among the initial recommendations, do they believe that all of the priorities have been applied, and is that particular list meeting agency priorities. The selection official then approves the list, and then as I mentioned, we would go ahead and vet those particular awards, making sure they're in compliance with various USDA regulations, and then we would announce our awards in May to the public. So one quick thing that I saw in the chat box, folks were asking, will each team member review all of the applications given to your team? And yes, you will. Everyone actually submits reviews for each of the applications that they are assigned to. And we'll get a little bit more into that with the deep dive into the review process. So what are your responsibilities as a reviewer? So the first thing is that you should submit your conflict of interest form, which at this point we've actually collected all of those, so everyone can breathe a sigh of relief. You have covered that. You may be wondering, how many proposals am I actually going to be reviewing? So typically we try not to assign more than 10 proposals, so you can anticipate that you'll receive about that. You are to submit scores, and you are to provide feedback, written feedback. In addition, you are expected to participate in a team review meeting call, which we'll talk a little bit more about that. And after you have that team call, you will be expected to update your scores and feedback based on those conversations. And then finally, at the end of the review period, we ask about your experience. And so we definitely want you to be submitting feedback to us here in National Office about your experience as a reviewer. So you may be asking, how do I prepare for review? What should I be doing? So one of the things you want to do, along with the Farm to School 101 webinar slides and recording, I sent out the FY18 Farm to School Grant Program request for applications. So in there is kind of what applicants had received in order to apply to our grant program. So it's a really good document for reviewers to be familiar with, in terms of just kind of understanding the intent of the funding and what was asked of applicants. You'll also want to familiarize yourself with the reference materials that we'll be sending out later this week. So that will include a score sheet, point allocation guidance, and the projects that involve one-sheeters. So the score sheet and the point allocation guidance we'll get a little bit deeper into later in this webinar training. And the projects that involve one-sheeters are actually things that I covered in the Farm to School 101 training. So I will actually be changing those into some Word documents so that you can kind of reference if your grant application talks about school gardens or local procurement or curriculum or educational opportunities, that you could kind of reference those for some guiding principles as you're reviewing those applications and trying to determine whether it is a strong project or not. In terms of preparing for the review, you'll also want to just get familiar with partnerweb and making sure that you understand how to submit your score sheet in there, which will also provide some more details on that. And then you'll also want to make sure that you know how to download your apps. So I will be getting into that as well. So in terms of the reference materials, the score sheet, we actually have a score sheet for each grant track type. So as I mentioned, there are 3: planning, implementation, and training. So when you are assigned your grant applications, you're going to want to make sure that you are familiar with the score sheet for your particular grant track type. So on that score sheet, there are going to be different sections that kind of talk about the budget, evaluation, sustainability. So very specific things that we want you all to be looking at when you are reviewing your application and trying to determine how to score it. And so for each section, it has a certain number of points that are allocated to them, and you have to determine if you need to deduct points because certain things were not properly described or outlined or synthesized. So you'll see to the right that we kind of have assigned modifiers to each of the points. So an excellent for this particular section would be 20 points. A very good is 16 points, so on and so forth. So that's just to kind of give you a sense of when you're trying to determine, did they do well on this particular criteria? That's a good way to kind of figure out how to allocate your points. For further clarification, what does excellent mean? What does very good mean? The point allocation guidance reference sheet really helps to maintain that kind of scoring consistency so that all of the reviewers can somewhat be on the same page or be on the same page regarding what does an excellent or a very good mean. So for the point allocation guidance, you're going to really want to make sure that you familiarize yourself with each of these particular categories so that you know how many points you should be deducting when you evaluate your particular application against a particular category. So something that has been particularly helpful for reviewers in the past is kind of understanding for the previous cycle, what was kind of the break-off point for an application being seen as overall high scoring or overall making the cut to be considered for funding. And so I wanted to make sure that I provided this information to you all this year so you could kind of be on the same page. We all know that there's folks who may grade a little bit more harshly than others. So this is a good way for you to kind of gauge, at the end of the day when I add up all my points, if I were talking to the selection official, based on what I read, do I think that this is a project that should be considered for funding or not? And so for planning grants last year, to be even considered for funding, you had to have at least 88.3 out of 100 points. And then for implementation grants, it was at least a 90.7. And so we averaged the scores, so that's why you're seeing these point somethings here. When you are assigning points to your applications in the various sections, you are using whole numbers. So please do not provide me any 18.3 out of 20s. You are using whole numbers. And then in terms of training, it was actually on a 50-point scale, and for this year we moved it to a 100-point scale. So for me to provide that information to you, it would not be very useful. So another reference material which you have to be less concerned with since you are a reviewer is the activity checklist. And so when you log on to partnerweb, which I will give you more information about a little bit later, I know I keep teasing you about partnerweb, I just wanted you to know what that particular resource is. So as a reviewer, you do not need to be concerned with the activity checklist. The team lead actually completes this particular form. But just for your overall knowledge, the activity checklist is essentially a list of various activities that the team lead will, if it is found in that particular proposal, that they will then kind of check it off on the activity checklist. And that will give us in National Office and the Office of Community Food Systems just a general sense of, for all the applications we received, what are those trends in terms of proposals? So are people submitting funding that include both quantitative and qualitative measures? Are they submitting proposals that touch on pork and beef or school garden development? It's just a really good way for us to kind of get a sense of the trends in the proposals that are being submitted to us. And we actually compile all of that data into our Summary of Awards report that we publish each year. So here we go again. So as you all remember, the review starts January 29th and it ends February 9th. It's a 2-week period. And so during this time, you are not engaging with your team members. It's the independent review portion of the review period. So you are in a dark closet reviewing your applications with a nice cup of tea or your beverage of choice, and reading it closely and using all of your supporting reference materials, your score sheet, and your point allocation guidance, and your projects that involve one-sheeters to review your applications. And you are in fact assigning scores on each of those categories, and you are in fact writing written feedback, which is both strengths and weaknesses. So as I had mentioned, if you're forgetting, when am I going to get my applications and how am I going to get them? We're going to do it through WatchDocs. You guys should have a link to your applications by the end of the week. Worst case scenario, early next week. As I mentioned, and this is critically important, big stars, bells, whistles, all of it, it is incredibly important that you all next week start to do that work of scanning your applications and letting us know if there are any conflicts of interest. Because if there is a conflict of interest for you, we will have to swap an application with another team. And we want to be able to do all of that during the week of January 22nd. So don't wait till the end of next week to take a look at that. Start doing that early next week so we have time to execute. So if you have a conflict of interest, you should reach out to the Farm to School inbox, email address on the screen, and we will get that swap to happen. What counts as a conflict of interest? We outlined potential conflicts of interest on that conflict of interest form that everyone signed and had their supervisor sign and submitted. But really quickly here, a financial interest in a particular organization, if that's the case for you, then you probably shouldn't be reviewing that application. If you formerly worked for that application, you work very closely with them right now, your best friend is the director, anything that could bias you or look funny if an outside auditor were to become aware of that relationship, you're going to want to recuse yourself from reviewing that application. So again, let us know and we'll make sure to get that swapped. As I mentioned, during this time you are not talking with other folks on your panel. And the key thing I wanted to push here is we really want you all to submit that feedback and those scores online no later than February 9th, 9 a.m. So not end of day, 9 a.m. because this gives us time, us meaning team leads, to take a look at what has been submitted and to make sure that that the feedback is comprehensive and clear and makes sense, and that you all are on track in terms of the timeline for the review period. And when I say scan, that is correct, Michelle. I mean that you should be doing a visual scan, not scanning your applications in a scanning machine. Okay, scoring applications. So as I've been saying throughout the presentation thus far, you're not just providing a numerical score. You're going to be exercising some of those English muscles. You are going to be providing written feedback for each of the categories. So you're going to have to record your comments in the forms of strengths and weaknesses. And you're going to want to make sure that your score really aligns with those written comments that you are submitting. So what I have seen in the past is folks will take off, for a section in which you can be awarded 20 points, someone takes off 10. And then you take a look at the strengths and there's one strength, and then you take a look at the weaknesses and there's one weakness. Now, if you have taken off half of the points for a particular section, you're going to have to tell me a little bit more about why you did that. So just putting one bullet is not helpful. Like, be very clear about why you are deducting points and making sure that your comments are in line with kind of the severity in which you deducted points as well. So really wanted to drive that home. And as I mentioned, submitting your comments and scores through partnerweb. All right, so that completes the independent review. So team review guidelines. So as I said, this is the second 2-week period, and this is from February 12th through the 23rd. And so during this time, this is when you get to make friends again and you can engage with the other folks on your team. So your team lead is actually going to determine a time or a couple of times during that 2-week period for you all to discuss all of the applications that you have been assigned. And during that call, you really should come prepared to discuss your score and the strengths and weaknesses of the application by each of the categories. That's why we really want people to have that done by February 9th. And then based on that discussion, you may or may not choose to adjust your scores. So this is the opportunity for folks to kind of get a sense of, hey, am I too harsh of a reviewer, or am I too easy of a reviewer? This is the point in which you can see if there is a pretty wide discrepancy between your score for an application and someone else's, that maybe there is room for discussion, and maybe there's something that you missed, or maybe you were deducting points too heavily. But this really gives a time for people to calibrate their scores. You're not required to come out all giving an application 100 or a 90 or a 75, but it is the space for folks to kind of get a gut check on whether or not they were being too lenient or too harsh in the way that they were grading their particular applications. So you may think to yourself like, what, me harsh, or what, me too easy? I think one of the things that I have often seen is that people get in a groove after they've scored the first 1 to 2 applications, and so maybe the first 2 were graded too harshly or they were graded too easily. So again, this process kind of helps folks to gut check that, even though they wouldn't have thought to have done that. Okay, and so if you end up changing your scores or adjusting them, you would of course go back into partnerweb and make your updates there. Okay, everybody should take a deep breath, maybe do a little stretch. It's 2:31, we're about halfway through. You're doing good, you're doing great. So one of the things that I really wanted to impress upon folks, or kind of orient folks to, is the anatomy of the grant application package. So for my friends who have done this last year, thank you for returning. I think you might have been really overwhelmed to get the grant application package because it's pretty darn meaty. So I wanted folks to kind of understand what's coming to them. So when you receive a grant application, what you will likely see is all of these different pieces of your grant application. And what's been wonderful is our friends in financial management have actually organized it in an order so that as you get each of your grant applications, it should be in this specific order. Not all of them will have a screening checklist, but most of them will. So really quickly, you might be wondering like, oh my goodness, how many pages are associated with this package? And so you probably will get in your hands, for most folks, training grant packages are a bit smaller, but you could get from anywhere to 30 to 40 pages. And why there's such a variation is that there are optional attachments. And so some folks get really crazy and attach all of the things, while others are a bit more judicious and only attach a few things. So what's important? What do you have to focus in on, and what are all these different pieces? So very quickly, the screening checklist is just a checklist. When we received all of the applications, we had to go through them to make sure that they had all of the necessary components, and if they didn't, that we knew that. So we had a screening checklist to just kind of capture that information. The Farm to School cover sheet kind of provides demographic information about, how many schools are going to be touched, who's it going to reach. And then there's a table of contents to orient you, us, the reviewer, to what's in the application package, and it has page numbers. You will see your proposal narrative, which is really what is this project about, and they are responding to all of those questions that we had in the RFA. The budget narrative, which really is going to include an itemized budget as well as the justification and rationale for each of those line items. You will see resumes of the folks that are intended to work on the project if it were funded. You'll also see support letters. So support letters are required for all of the grant track types. We are not deducting points if they are missing, but if they are missing, you should probably just flag that in your comments. Please refer to the RFA in terms of how many support letters should be included in your particular grant package. It varies by grant type. I believe it to be 1 support letter for training and 3 for planning and 3 for implementation. Then you'll have your optional attachments. The folks that are really good grant writers, these will be things that they reference in their proposal narrative. Please see Appendix A for blah, blah, blah. But I've seen grant application packages where people kind of just get excited and they're like, this is this awesome presentation I did about Farm to School. Like, here it is attached. So it could really run the gamut. in terms of your role as a reviewer, what do you need to be taking a look at? And I skipped over all of the final things, which is terrible of me. These are important government forms that you all do not have to worry about, but these are standard form packages that the federal government, USDA, typically requests when someone is applying for funding. So as a reviewer, you should be really focusing in on those pieces of information that's highlighted in green. You're going to want to take a really close look at that piece of the grant application package, because that's where all of the different criteria that you're grading against is going to be found in these particular pieces. One thing I wanted to flag about optional attachments, the max is 10 pages. So if you get to the optional attachments and there are more than 10 pages, please stop reading after the 10th page and just disregard anything that is optional and added after the 10th page. Since there is that limit, we just don't want to give anyone an unfair advantage with communicating additional information to the review panel that others would not have been able to since they were listening to the rules. Okay, so I have been alluding to all of these systems that you all will be using, and so I wanted to make sure that we spent a little time talking about what they are. So again, as I said for the 5th time, you will be accessing your applications through Watchdocs. As you can tell, I really believe in redundancy in terms of kind of getting points across. I also know I'm throwing a lot of info at you guys. So Watchdocs, you may be wondering, how does this work? What is Watchdocs? Watchdocs is just a cloud software, so we are able to securely upload the applications into Watchdocs. Then you are able to access those applications through your computers. So how you will get access to Watchdocs is to, you will receive several emails, and you will be receiving these emails over the course of this week. So if you don't see it this week, you should see it by Monday, end of day. And if you don't, you should probably reach out to us. So the first email that you'll receive is probably a Welcome to Workspaces email. You can ignore that. There's no real action in that email. You will then receive another email, 2 more. So one of which is the Workspaces verification code email. And what I have in quotes is like what you're going to see in the subject line. And so that's going to contain a very important 6-digit authentication code. And then you'll receive a third email, which is going to say X, and it'll either be Anna or Carla, it'll insert their email address, has shared a workspace with you email. So that's the email you're going to want to open up, click the link in there. There's going to be a link that says Farm to School 2018, and it's going to open up your browser where it will then prompt you to enter your email address. You enter your email address and then the screen will reload and it'll ask you for a verification code. So go back to that Workspaces verification code email and grab that 6-digit authentication code. You go ahead and enter it, and then voila, you will have access to your applications. Yes, you can think of Watchdocs as like a Dropbox, just a place where you can get access to files. So when you are in Watchdocs, your applications are going to be organized by team. And as I had mentioned at the top of the webinar, you will be receiving an email that will provide you with your team assignment, who your team members are, and the grant type that you've been assigned to. You should be getting that by end of week, latest end of day Monday. So based on that information, you're going to go look for your team folder. No snooping around in other people's folders. Go to your team folder and view your applications. We're asking folks to refrain from downloading their applications to their personal computers because I know sometimes people may choose to review applications in different settings. So please do not. Some of these applications may have sensitive information within it, meaning PII, personally identifiable information. So we really want to minimize the different places where the application can live. So we are recommending you print your application and you keep it in a secure location and shred it, or just view your application through Watchdocs. I mean, I'm not going to beat you up if you download it to your work computer, but again, we're just trying to do our best to protect that information. Apps or your applications are going to be in PDF form. As an extra level of security, we do password protect them. So the password will be what you see on the screen, farm to school, all lowercase, one word. So as I had mentioned before, you'll be getting 3 emails. The emails are going to come from that email address that I have listed on the screen. As you can see, it is just primed to be forwarded to your spam folder. So please check your spam folder throughout this week, just to make sure that if you haven't seen it in your main inbox, that it's not hiding in your spam folder. As I mentioned, if you don't see these emails by end of week, January 19th or the 22nd, end of day, you're going to want to reach out to one of the grant officers. So we're splitting up this work by grant track type or grant type. So if you have an implementation grant, you're going to reach out to Anna, and then if you've been assigned planning or training, you'll reach out to Carla, and they can resolve that issue for you. So then in terms of submitting your scores and feedback, you will submit them through partnerweb. Partnerweb, some of you may already be familiar with. It's an online SharePoint site that's managed by USDA. We are in the process this week of getting folks set up with partnerweb accounts. If you already have a partnerweb account, that's what you will use. And when I'm setting up the account, I believe my friends in partnerweb will let me know if you already have an existing account. If you don't have an account, one will be created for you. So let's go ahead and walk through the system. So really quickly, I took a series of screenshots here so that you guys can be able to easily reference this later when you're in the thick of reviewing. Or I should say next week when you're just taking a look and getting familiar. So you're going to want to go to partnerweb.usda.gov. Your username will be your first initial plus your last name. So for example, like if you're John Smith, your username would be J. Smith. What's going to happen is that you're going to receive an email from partnerweb, the email address listed on the screen, and it will contain a password for you. This is for new users. If you are already an existing partnerweb user, you will not receive this email, and you should already know what your password is. If you don't know what your password is, in either case, you can always just go to this screen, go ahead, do first initial, last name, and then say forgot my password, and it should kind of prompt you and ask you some information, and you should be able to track down your password. I mean, in some cases the username isn't this nomenclature, but in many cases it is. And if it's not and you're having issues, just reach on out to Farm to School and we'll get it resolved for you all. So it looks like I jumped the gun a little. So once you actually log in, you could be taken to this kind of home page for partnerweb. And so what you're going to want to do in order to get to the Farm to School website, you're going to want to go to look to your left under Communities, and you should see FM Farm to School Grants, and you'll want to go ahead and click that. Once you click that, you'll be brought to the fantastic, exciting world of the USDA Farm to School Grants Review site. And so we have some kind of orienting information for you here in the center of the screen. The things that I really want to quickly draw your attention to are all of the fantastic resources that will be right there on the front page. We'll put links to webinars and slides and recordings, as well as kind of any of those supporting materials, point allocation guidance, all that should be found here. So in terms of actually diving in, the first thing that you're going to want to do if you've forgotten or can't find the email that the Farm to School team would have sent you about what your team assignment is, we're sending it by end of week, early next week, is you're going to want to click Step 1 on the left-hand side. And so when you click Step 1, you will be brought to this page. And right here on the left-hand side, you'll see that there will be a list of reviewers. This is old information. And you'll be able to sort it by panelist ID. So when you click panelist ID, it'll alphabetize it. So you'll be able to see, hey, I'm on Team 1. You can see that on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, you can see if you are a lead or not. Am I with the yes or no under the lead column. So once you've identified your team, you then can go ahead and identify your grant track type. And so that information is actually found on the right-hand side. So let's say I'm Abby B. I see on the left that I'm Team 1. I then would go over here to the right-hand side and go ahead and click the little box, the little plus box that's next to Team 1. And underneath it, I'll see what my grant track type is. And then I'll also see a list of all of the applications that have been assigned to me. Just go ahead and highlighting the grant track type information where you would find it. Another thing I want to point to that's really important and can be really easy to miss is that the FNS ID is also found here. And you'll need that information for when you're submitting a score sheet. You'll also see the application name. So again, when you're submitting your score sheet, you're going to be asked to enter the applicant name. So you're going to want to make sure that you're using this information here to enter that information on the score sheet. And this is all very important for tracking on our end. So now that you found your team, you found out what grant track type you are, and you found out which applications you've been assigned to, you now go ahead and advance to step 2 where you can start to actually score. So step 2 was found on the left-hand side. You clicked what grant track type you were. So we selected implementation because I'm Abby B today. And you're brought to this screen. And so now you're going to want to start to score. So you want to pull up a score sheet. So up here on the right-hand side, highlighted in red, is the Add a Score Sheet for implementation. So you're going to want to go ahead and click that. When you click that, you're brought to this page, and you're going to want to look up to the left and click New, and then click New Item. And by doing that, you will then be brought to a score sheet. And so something I just want to highlight really quickly, basically this is just the online version of the form. I will be sending out the Word version so you all can kind of get familiar with it over the course of next week. But it's really, really important that you enter the correct panelist ID, and all of this will be available in a drop-down menu, that you enter the correct team number and you enter the correct FNS ID, because we will be receiving nearly 1,000 reviews, and when this information is incorrect or off, it makes it very distasteful for me. So I greatly appreciate your attention in selecting the right information there. And then you're also going to want to enter that applicant name. Again, all this information is found on that step 1 page that we just went through. The other thing that people often ask is, I didn't get to finish the whole form for this particular application. Like, what can I do? Can I save it? So if you want to save a sheet, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to enter dummy information. So just go ahead and enter 0 in any of the fields that you were unable to complete. And then when you scroll to the bottom, the system will then allow you to submit the form. So you may be wondering like, oh, but when I come back, how do I get back to that sheet to edit it? And so how you do that is that all of your saved score sheets will be found on the step 2 page, which again you can navigate to it by going to your left. Now to edit a saved score sheet, you're going to want to click that little paper icon next to that particular score sheet of interest. And then if you, again, you may have a number of particular score sheets that you're looking at. So remember that by clicking the header, you can really order in ascending or descending order to find what you're looking for. So by clicking that little icon, you then would actually open up back the score sheet, and you'll be able to edit it and take out your zeros and add actual information. Okay. We're at 2:49, and at this time I'm going to kick it over to Carla.
Hi, Maika. Thank you so much for that. So again, we are going to be covering some tips for success. Again, my name is Carla Garcia. So if I can move the slide, let me just verify. Yep. Okay. So we have some information here on point allocation, as you can see. FNS has the scoring sheets and the point allocation here for you to take a look at. This is going to help you with your scoring. So obviously there's some numbers involved here so that we can find out their total score. So these are really important. You're going to want to make sure that you refer to the sheet for reference. This is again excerpted from the scoring sheet itself, so it's the exact sheet that you're already going to have for reference. But what you're looking at is somewhat of an idea of what would be considered a strong proposal versus a weaker one, and ultimately this is how we're going to determine who is going to get selected. So it's imperative that you guys are being consistent with your number scoring as far as what is considered very good versus excellent. And so this is a range that we are asking you to look at and follow so that the numbers are consistent and it works out at the end. So again, excellent is we have number 20, and you've got a range that you are obviously looking at. And then very good is 16, good is 12. So again, we're talking about ranges, fair, poor, and unresponsive, right? You might not have anything to enter for that particular criteria, so that would be unresponsive, and you see the 0. So again, this is for consistency. You want to make sure you're consistent as you start with your first proposal all the way to the second, third, fourth, and as Maika has already stated, there's going to be several. So if you're consistent and everyone who's reviewing is consistent, then we will get the best applicants, and that is ultimately what we want to do, and we want to make sure that that consistency is aligning across the board. The other thing we're asking you to look at is make sure your scores align with your written feedback. So for example, if you have a very weak proposal, then we're expecting some feedback that is written that is going to state what part of it was weak, whether it was unresponsive altogether, so they had a lot of zeros, or whether that would be, a specific criteria that would have been outlined where you would be specific and concise as to why they scored low. The same thing applies as if it's a very strong proposal. If it's a strong proposal, then obviously you're going to be on the higher spectrum of the numbers, and then you're also going to have a lot of feedback on strengths and just emphasizing what part of it was what you felt was excellent. Now here's some written feedback information. There is going to be a section for comments, and when you're writing these comments in partnerweb, which is the system that Ms. Sanders and Maika just covered with you all, this is where you're capturing that information. So the proposal strengths and weaknesses are going to be used to support our decision. So first of all, you want to make sure you capture them in partnerweb. That's where you're entering your information and, for any of the review process. And you're going to have a section with strengths and weaknesses. This is imperative because, again, we're going to take this at the end and we provide this feedback to the applicants themselves, upon request, of course. But so we're asking you, we have some very specific criteria of what we're looking for and what we expect so that we can then take that and provide effective feedback to the grantee. Again, make sure you're using concise feedback. That should be based on the criteria outlined in the RFA. You should be able to keep in mind that the remarks are going back to the public, so please make these clear. It's going to make it easier for us to review them and then provide the feedback. So again, the applications appreciate, or the applicants themselves are going to appreciate receiving the thoughtful feedback, and they use it to improve their future applications. So as an applicant, they want us to provide specific information for the different sections in the RFA on what they can either improve. Mostly when we're going back, we are going back to applicants that did not receive an award. So they are looking to do better next round potentially. So they are going to be waiting for this feedback. So again, we're just emphasizing and we're making it clear that anything you're writing, we can take that information and then we provide it during the debriefing process. This is kind of an example of an ideal written feedback and what we're looking for. So these are examples. So on the PowerPoint, you're going to see focus on strengths and weaknesses. So again, we emphasize strengths and weaknesses because typically that is the form that you're looking at online. You're going to have the strengths section and the weakness sections. You can always add a comment as well. but it is critical that you make sure that the feedback is constructive. Here's an example of well-written and specific justification of a score. So we've got a strength here. Someone came in as an example when they wrote, the school district has strong community partners, and they're ready to help implement the project. Here's another example. The district aims to increase the variety of local products to include protein, in general turkey and beef. So not only did they provide the feedback, but now we know exactly what it was that they believed was strong. There's also a weakness section, and in this specific section they provided the budget narrative did not clearly explain all the proposal project expenses, particularly the supplies and equipment. Once again, you can see that in this section they were specific, and so anyone looking at it, including the applicant themselves, will know exactly what section they failed to explain thoroughly. And there's another example here as well. So again, just when you're writing that feedback, in order to make it ideal, you want to make it clear for the applicant what it was that was missing or lacking, or if it was a strength, what specific thing it was that made it a strong proposal. Written feedback. So less than ideal written feedback. Here's some examples. You can see here under simply listing activities without saying how they impact the school. So you've got garden vegetables and classroom activities. So the garden vegetables and classroom activities doesn't really provide us much information. We don't really know what was that. Was it good? Was it bad? And then you've got local carrots and potatoes. Again, less than ideal. We're looking for specific information. Another thing, here's a strength. You have someone that wrote great, but we don't know what exactly that would be. So again, not ideal. And then sometimes people will write, well, good example on page 7. Well, page 7 is an entire page, so we wouldn't know what. So again, you can see how that would be less than ideal as well. Another example, weakness. Seems like a waste of funds. Not exactly very nice and not exactly very specific. So again, those are things, just use good judgment when you're writing these. One of the things we ask you to do before you submit, obviously you might have your first one and you just continue. You might get better at it as you go through them. Just before you submit them on partnerweb, we're asking you to go through and kind of check them and just kind of check your information. And some of the things you can look for, this is somewhat of a checklist. You can look for grammatically correct, appropriate punctuation, is it clear, was it offensive to someone? Does the feedback reflect what that you've closely reviewed the material submitted by the applicant? And finally, did it align with the amount of points deducted? That just has to do with what I stated earlier. If you have a lot of weaknesses, you're justifying a low score. If you have a lot of strengths, you're emphasizing perhaps that it was a very strong proposal. Sorry, I'm getting feedback myself from Ms. Sanderson that I probably need to raise the volume, so I just did. Thank you, Maika. So now I'm going to keep going. Hopefully that's better. So I apologize. I did just raise the volume. So here are some feedback examples. So for this particular one, you see this section is vague and it lacked details. Well, this is a bad example because we don't know what detail you're talking about. So as you can see, like if you're looking at it from our angle, the applicant would have no idea either. Here they kind of so-so, somewhat okay comment. It says more detail is needed to justify how each budget line was arrived at, especially travel and equipment section. And then you have an excellent. I think for the one that was so-so, it's just kind of lacking detail still. So then excellent, you can see how it's very thorough. All right, it's well written. And the applicant can take this back. It says more detail is needed to justify how the budget line items were estimated, especially travel and equipment sections. Travel costs appear to be excessive. And then it talks about the equipment to be purchased for the kitchen is not specific. So again, I don't want to read the whole thing, but you can see how this specific example would take us to a specific section in the budget and would identify the specific line items. I'm going to move on to the next one. Please, please, please don't be mean, but do be clear, direct, and honest. So someone just wrote here, this is in a mean one, the sustainability plan is weak. It appears they believe everything will just work once they get the ball rolling. It is a bit too simple for the reality of a project like this. Again, be constructive. The point is not to be demeaning in these applications. So by all means, be nice, folks, and just make sure that you use good judgment on that too. Nice. We have an example of nice, and this might seem excessive, but sometimes we get some odd ones like this. So just keep it real and make sure that the applicants understand exactly what it is that was either weak or strong with the proposal. So the very nice feedback example here is proposal would be strengthened with clarification of how ongoing support of a project goal will be managed after the grant has ended with state and local funding. So again, that's clear and concise. Well, we get a lot of questions moving on to another section of the review process when you're looking at the budget. So what do you look for when you're looking in that budget section? Well, you want to evaluate the budget, first of all, based on the RFA criteria. And the RFA criteria can sometimes be, I know, a little bit vague, but you want to remain objective and look at the technical aspects of the grant. And this applies throughout, but even in the budget. So you want to read the budget narrative and review that the items proposed are necessary and reasonable to complete the work described in the proposal. So what we're asking you to do is just read. You've read the proposal. You know what they're planning on doing. So we're asking you to check to make sure that whatever they've proposed in the budget has to do with the work that is being proposed. So again, there's just very specific. So it says, they should discuss the line items in the itemized budget. So you're reading the narrative. That should have been discussed. The budget estimates are reasonable in price in light of the project scope. The expenses align with the project goals and objectives. The anticipated project expenses are accounted for in the budget and budget narrative. And the budget narrative should justify the cost. So if a key partner is receiving portion of funding, they should provide a rationale for the partner's participation in the project, and it should be provided. We're asking you to not deduct points, but flag the following information. We get a lot of questions on this. So again, if you're not sure, we're going to have some project leads for the review panel that will be able to answer this, but you can always refer back to this. Planning and implementation grant budgets didn't include a line item for face-to-face meeting with the USDA personnel. We do have a requirement for the conference. So if you notice that information is not there, please flag it for us. Write it in a comment where, we're not asking you to deduct points. But if you notice a discrepancy in budget numbers, again, we do want the comments. And we're not asking you to determine if the items are allowable either. So if you have a question about it, by all means, you can send an email to myself or Anna, and we can certainly let you know. But we're asking for comments. We are asking you to use your judgment as far as the story of the grant itself is concerned. You want to make sure that it aligns with whatever they propose. So if they're working on gardens, then the budget might have tools for gardens, and that's justifiable. So just things that make common sense. I'm going to move on to the next section. Key steps for a successful review. Once you receive your partnerweb username and password, make sure you can log in successfully by January 24th. And if you have any questions, you should always just, when in doubt, you can contact Farm to School for help. We want you to scan your applications. So you're going to be getting those applications here shortly, including the support letters. And one of the things you need to pay attention is conflict of interest. So if you get that application and you worked for the entity, for example, then that would be a conflict of interest. You won't know that till you get them. We're asking that you go ahead and notify us as soon as possible. We're asking no later than January 24th. If you have any issue with the application itself, that you notify Farm to School at fns.usda.gov. During the individual review, we typically recommend that you allocate at least 2 hours per the application and that you spread them out across the period. And then complete your independent reviews by February 9th. So This list has pretty important dates for you to keep in mind. I mean, the main one is January 24th, that's one, and then February 9th. So just make sure you have that information. Be reliable. Obviously, we're all at different locations. We're asking that you work with your panel leads respectively. You'll probably get lots of emails from Farm to School. If you're not sure about something, don't hesitate to email us. And then be responsive to scheduling the request and prompt about notifying team leads of time conflicts. I mean, we have a very, we appreciate everyone's time, and if at any point something comes up, just notify us and get a hold of us. And then be open to the opinions of others. We have a very unique team of folks reviewing, so you want to make sure that you're open to that. If you decide to revise a score based on the team discussion. So this is going to happen when you all reconvene. When you reconvene as a team, you get to discuss the scores. And when that happens, we're asking that you go back and that you revise, where necessary, strengths and weaknesses in partnerweb. So we want to capture the storyline of what happened during the review process. So if you change your score, you had an 80, for example, and after discussing it with your teammates, you discovered that maybe a portion that you thought wasn't there was maybe on page 60 in some odd place, then you would put a note saying, I gave them a weakness point here. However, the information was located on page 60. They have addressed the equipment information, or they've addressed, whatever it was that was lacking. You just want to capture that in partnerweb. That's very important. And without further ado, again, thank you all for reviewing. When in doubt, don't hesitate to ask us for help. And I'm going to pass this on to my colleague, Maika. Thank you.
Thanks, Carla. So I see that we're over time. It's 3:06. I kind of anticipated this at the beginning because there's so much information to give you all. So folks who have to step off, feel free to do so. I am recording, but we are almost through, just a handful of slides, and then I'm going to open it up to Q&A. So in terms of asking for help, we just wanted to make sure that you know who to reach out to and the best way to reach out to them. So if you're having problems with partnerweb, you reach out to Farm to School. So maybe you can't submit a score or you can't do that initial login, go ahead and reach out to us and we could try to do a few things to troubleshoot. And then if not, we'll push you off to our friends at partnerweb. If you're having issues with Watchdocs, as I mentioned, we'll go to Anna for implementation. Planning and training, you should reach out to Carla and they will be able to assist. And then issues with conflicts of interest, as in you've identified one. And sometimes, hopefully we'll identify all of them next week, but sometimes during the review period you may see something that you didn't recognize before. Please contact Farm to School ASAP so that we can address that as quickly as possible. How can you receive speedy assistance? So it's really important that you know what your team number is and what your grant type is. It saves us one step in terms of looking up who you're assigned to or who you're working with. So if you could provide that number when you're reaching out to us with issues, that's just helpful. You want to make, and people have been asking, when am I going to know my team number and when am I going to know my assignment? We are going to be sending that information to you all by end of week. If not then, definitely by end of day Monday, the 22nd. Make sure that you clearly state your issue and use screenshots. It's so helpful to see a picture. Use screenshots whenever applicable to help us understand your issue. So I wanted to give you guys a big thumbs up. You're doing great. I just have 2 more slides where I'm going to give you all the recap and then we'll open it up to Q&A. And so really quickly, just wanted to summarize a few key dates and next steps. So right now what you can be doing, you have access to the request for applications. So you want to make sure that you're reviewing those now. We'll make the reference materials available shortly, probably later this week. So as soon as those are released, we will shoot out an email and make sure that you all have it. We'll send it out as attachments. And then for next week, January 22nd through the 24th, please make sure you log into partnerweb. We should have had an account created for you by then. Make sure you access your applications on Watchdocs and take a look for conflicts of interest and then just notify Farm to School. Doing it by the 24th gives us time to fix everything by the end of the week. So make sure that you do that. So we want to remind folks that January 29th through February 9th is the independent review period where you'll be reviewing your 10 proposals and submitting your scores and your written feedback. February 12th through the 23rd is when you're having those team reviews and you actually engage with team members to discuss your scoring. And then by February 23rd, you want to make sure that you have adjusted any scores or comments in partnerweb after you've talked with your team. Sometimes folks forget to make that adjustment. And then, of course, by mid-March, we would have wanted to have heard from you about your experience as a reviewer. We have, in fact, reached the end of this journey. So at this time, we're going to open it up to Q&A. Folks have been asking some questions throughout which have already been answered, but I do see I have a queue of questions here. So feel free to put a few more in the box. I'm happy to get to it. We'll hang on as long as there are questions. So one of the questions was around what if an applicant uses a smaller font than required and therefore includes more information? If it appears that a smaller font has been used, I can't remember off the top of my head what we request, but it is in the RFA. So if you notice that by chance, just feel free to reach out to the Farm to School inbox and we will determine how to handle that. Someone had asked, is Watchdocs like Dropbox? And yes, essentially Watchdocs is like a Dropbox. We have another question. Have we received our track assignments? No. Track assignments haven't been sent out yet. They will be sent out no later than January 22nd, end of day. But we're hoping to get this out to you guys by end of week. Someone asked, when will backup reviewers know if they are needed? So backup reviewers, at this time we are fully slotted and slated and ready to go in terms of reviewers for the review period. But what we have found in past years is that during the actual review period, people will have last minute conflicts or engagements come up and they are no longer able to serve. So it is possible that we could be reaching out to you anywhere between now and the end of the review period, which I believe I said was February 23rd. Yes, February 23rd. So I'm sorry to kind of have you guys on the edge of your seats there. Another question is from Anne. Are the team leads usually past reviewers for F&S? In that being asked, can team leads guide us reviewers during the group calls with suggestions or pointers on our feedback? Great question, Anne. Actually, we're a step ahead of you. So to your first question, yes. Oftentimes, team leads have actually served at least as a reviewer in the past and more than likely have served as a team lead in the past. So they're familiar with this process. They are actually going to be taking a look at your review feedback that you've submitted, which is why we're asking that you submit it by February 9th, 9 a.m. so they can have a chance to kind of skim through what you all have submitted. So they will be providing some feedback for you all if your feedback isn't quite in line with what we shared today. Oftentimes when feedback isn't in alignment, it's mostly because reviewers wait until the last minute to conduct their reviews. So in general, you shouldn't be afraid about whether or not your feedback is going to pass the test. If you just give yourself enough time to read the application and thoughtfully write feedback, it's usually great. So just don't procrastinate. Rachel asked, are all of the comments foyable? Carla, do you want to take this one, or did you want me to answer this one?
I'm sorry, is what part foyable? I caught most.
So Rachel had asked, are all of the comments, like the comments submitted by reviewers, are they foyable?
Yes. So one of the things you have to keep in mind is not only they're foyable, but one of the things I always tell folks is this could potentially, not that it's going to, but this is open information. So we don't usually put out scores, but if for whatever odd reason someone were to take us to court, this is information that could be brought up. So we always tell folks, this is why we emphasize no mean comments, be consistent in your scoring, use the criteria we outlined with the numbers. So it's kind of emphasizing that, we do that as well to make sure we have a thorough process. The answer is yes, it is. very oddly has that happened. We don't release it to grantees. I think it's more along the lines of if it needed to be used in court. That has never happened since I've been here, but I don't know if that's along the lines of foiable where somebody's going to request it. It hasn't happened. And Maika, feel free to share. I haven't had that happen while I've been here.
Yeah, I haven't either, but to Carla's point, I would say about 40% of applicants reach out and ask for feedback. So this exercise that you're doing isn't just sitting in some government archive collecting dust. Like, we send this information out. And so that's why we spent so much time going through what we're looking for, because when we actually have to pull all of this information together and send it out, it's a very painful process to have to rewrite feedback or have to go back to applications because we don't understand what a reviewer has written. So please, please, please make sure to take time to write thoughtful feedback in concordance with the information shared today. There was a question, any restrictions on printing apps to review, guidance on saving hard or electronic copies? I believe this was answered in the chat box, but I just think the information is important. You are able to print it, but it is confidential information. It should not be forwarded along to anyone, not even your team members. If folks cannot access their applications, they really have to reach out to us in national office, Carla or Anna, in order to get that information. You can save a copy, but again, you should treat this as confidential information. We have a question. If the proposal budget exceeds the cap of $100,000, how should we handle? And we would ask that you not deduct points, but that you flag that in the comments. So great question. We have another question about, will backup reviewers receive anything or just when they are needed? And as to kind of expound upon that, backup reviewers are only called in when we have a reviewer that has dropped out. And oddly enough, it happens every year. I probably usually have about 5 or 6 people that thought they could review, and literally in the middle of the review period or in the beginning they drop out. So do not fret or think that your time is in vain. We often do tap our backup reviewers. It ends up happening. So there's no real action for backup reviewers until they are tapped. So backup reviewers will be notified of whether their service is needed by February 23rd, because the end of the review period is February 23rd. So as I had mentioned before, people can drop out at any time or phase. And then the other part of the question is, in other words, how can a backup reviewer help after the individual reviews have already been submitted? It's been a very rare instance in where this has happened, because typically we like to have consistency across reviews. So sometimes it just depends on the situation. So if we have already passed the individual review period and someone drops out, depending on the bandwidth of that backup reviewer, we would ask them, hey, can you individually score these applications and then get on this team call? And we would just have the team lead hold that team call at the end of that team review period, so that you have about a week to review all those applications. And so we'll try to take those scores. So it's kind of like the backup reviewer has to kind of do double time, if you will, to catch up and try to kind of help out. That has been rare where I've had someone drop out so late in the game. One time I've had it that someone was able to do their independent reviews, but they couldn't finish it for one application, so I had a backup reviewer do one application. So that also happened. So there are a number of ways that we could kind of call in the backup reviewers to pitch in. I believe we have covered all of the questions. I don't see anything else in the chat box. We've kind of hit everything. Again, I hope you all aren't feeling too overwhelmed. We are so excited to have you all on board. As I mentioned in the 101 review, without you we wouldn't be able to do this. So thank you for serving. Be on the lookout for all of these emails that will be coming your way from partnerweb and Watchdocs and directly from the Farm to School inbox. And if you have any questions, that's my contact information, so feel free to shoot me an email or give me a ring. All right. You all have a great rest of your day, and thank you for joining us.